right team beside you to help you move on when the stakes are high and you can't go it alone. Frasier and Griffin bringing justice home.
Welcome back to Conversations with Ralph and Randy, where legal issues that affect the community are what we discuss. Now, I'm sitting here today with Ralph Frasier and Randy Griffin, and I am Chisa Penix Brown of Give It to the People. I get the pleasure of interviewing these gentlemen, and today we're going to talk about federal cases. So when we look at the justice system, you have your local cases, and then you have your federal cases. So how fast does a federal case move in comparison to a local case?
Federal cases tend to move pretty quickly. Once they get involved with first of all, when a federal agent typically approaches you, they've dotted their I's and crossed their T's generally. And so they typically already know the answers to the questions that they're going to ask you, and they typically already know whether or not you're going to be charged or not. And so these cases tend to move a little quicker. Typically, a federal case, you get indicted within about 90 days. You would typically have an arraignment, and you could be at trial at the period of 90 days. If not, then maybe you play it in, and then there's a sentencing, right? So the sentencing is typically 90 to 120 days after you plead in. So typically, a federal case is going to be done in 8 to 12 months. I have some state cases, quite frankly, right now that are going back to 2019, 2020. That doesn't happen in federal court. I think the oldest case I've ever had in federal court lingered around for about a year and a half. And in state court, these cases can sometimes linger around for years, just because the system is so backed up. And quite frankly, we're still catching up from COVID. Mm-hmm. There were so many cases that got backed up during the COVID period, and it really lasted about 2 years, not one. Mm-hmm. And so we've got cases that are still backed up from the COVID period that they haven't reached or haven't tried or haven't dealt with. Mm-hmm. So, like I say, federal cases tend to be a lot quicker, but the stakes tend to be a little higher.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So federal cases are more like your mom already knows that you messed up. And she knows all of the things that you did, but she's just waiting for you. And so when she brings it in, she knows the things that you've done. And now they just need to put it together. So the action is much more swift. And so with the local cases, why does it take so much longer?
Oftentimes with the local cases, they haven't completed their investigation. Oftentimes with the local cases, they just take longer to matriculate through the system. That typically a felony can sit in district court for 6 to 12 months, and then it's going to get indicted, and it could be in superior court for another 6 to 12 months. And then, if you're going to try it, you might not hit a trial calendar to another 12 months. And so you're 3 years away before you ever get to trial. And so that is how they differ.
So does that mean that this person is in jail the whole entire time?
Sometimes they're sitting in jail. It depends upon whether or not we're able to get them some kind of reasonable bond that they can make. And that's going to be a function of what the charges are. And quite frankly, there's just some new legislation that has actually made it getting a bond significantly harder for people who have some kind of repeat offenses.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. And so when you look at the federal cases, and, they're usually considered more serious. So what makes them harder to defend?
Well, it's because they typically have done their research. Mm-hmm. They have typically dotted their I's and crossed their T's. There's typically somebody who's already cooperated and given them a lot of information. State cases, sometimes they're tight like that, and sometimes they're not. Mm-hmm. But in federal court, at least in my experience, there are cases certainly where the feds haven't dotted their I's and crossed their T's. And that's why you need a good, solid lawyer to dig through that stuff and make sure that they've done everything they were supposed to do and that you're not facing anything more than you should be. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is that they have typically done their homework already.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talked about a previous conversation, and we were saying sometimes people say too much, that they are the ones that incriminate themselves. Can you touch on how something like social media, where people are literally telling on themselves, literally showing everything that they're doing. How has that affected your job as a lawyer to be able to help to protect your clients?
Well, social media and technology is just evolving every day, as people know now. So things that you share and put out on social media, it doesn't just go into a small room. It's on the internet. It's in the whole world. So, if you're posting guns or you're posting drugs, the officers now do look at social media accounts, and they do look to see what activities some people can be involved in if they become a suspect. So the technology is just amazing. The doorbell cameras. I've had cases where they've had suspects running from yard to yard, even involved in a crime of shooting or whatever. They see them getting in the cars, pick up license plates. And sometimes I joke and tell the clients, hey, you're in high definition. But the technology is amazing now. And so, what people do and put out there, that can be tracked and seen.
Now, what kind of things trigger federal involvement? Because if they're looking from something local that might turn into something federal, like you mentioned.
Guns and drugs.
Okay.
Guns and drugs are going to automatically trigger some kind of federal interest, typically. If you've got prior drug convictions and you've got a new gun and some guns and some drugs, you can almost be assured, in particular with this new environment that we're in, with this new U.S. Attorney's Office that we're dealing with, you can almost rest assured that they're going to be looking at that. That's the typical things that we run into. However, some homicides could be federal, can trigger, carjackings can trigger federal action. Some out and out murders can trigger federal action. Typically, there's got to be some violation of interstate commerce, but that's not a hard step to do, because if you use a firearm, quite frankly, then they can link you to interstate commerce, because that firearm was produced somewhere else, and it didn't come to you in North Carolina. It wasn't built in North Carolina, produced in North Carolina. It came through interstate commerce. And so typically any crime that you involve with a firearm can now be linked back to some kind of federal crime.
That's amazing. So basically, the purchase of the firearm that wasn't made in the state can then trigger interstate.
You have now been involved in interstate commerce, and if you utilize that firearm in some kind of way, then you can now, and that can allow the federal court to now have jurisdiction over a situation that they might not otherwise necessarily have.
That seems like a terrible loophole, though.
Well, it is a terrible
Because
loophole, and many people don't realize it's just that simple.
Wow. Okay. So, and even if people are, because North Carolina is notorious for having a gun show, right? But that doesn't mean that gun came from right there. So that is something to just acknowledge and just pay attention
Yeah, the gun you purchased at the gun show isn't a North Carolina gun.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay. So this is things that people need to know, right? This is what the community needs to know. So is there anything else that you would like to kind of enlighten people on, specifically from going from something that's local to something that's federal, things that people maybe should avoid in order to, if there's anything else that maybe you want to kind of touch on that doesn't necessarily fit into murder or guns or drugs, but it could go federal? Is there anything else we should consider?
Well, I will tell you that much of the stuff that I'm getting now is relating back to fraud that is relative to the 2020, when there was all this government
PPP
money flowing around,
Okay.
PPP loans. The federal government is working real hard to go back through and look at all of this documentation and paperwork that people were submitting regarding these businesses they allegedly had, and the income they were allegedly making. And they're going after the people. And in particular, they're going after our people. I will tell you, they're not going after the people that got 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, and were running other kind of businesses. They're going after the people in our community who, didn't have much to begin with, and, got a little bit. And so that's a lot of the cases that I'm getting right now that aren't related necessarily to guns and drugs for federal court.
That's good to know, though. That's good to know. All right, so gentlemen, we're going to wrap up this episode, and I want to thank you guys for sharing the wisdom with everybody and allowing people to just really kind of understand some of the differences and nuances between local and federal and things that they should avoid. So leave those drugs and those guns alone, everybody, and and make sure that you call your lawyer and make sure you have one that is inside of your phone that you can definitely reach out to, and that's Frasier and Griffin.
Move on when the stakes are high and you can't go it alone. Frasier and Griffin bringing justice home.